So this is my assignment 2.2 on steady state exercise. So firstly, whilst exercising, our supply of oxygen will eventually meet the levels that the body demands. This is steady state. So it only occurs in aerobic submaximal activities like 5,000 meters. And as you can see above, oxygen consumption is very low when we're resting. However, it suddenly increases when we start exercising and then levels off during steady state when the supply meets the demand. So we're going to start off with the cardiovascular system. So this is heart rate. So when someone starts exercising, the neural receptors detect various changes within the body. Firstly, there's baroreceptors, and these detect blood pressure changes in the arterial walls. Secondly, there's proprioceptors. These are sensory receptors, and they basically detect movement in the muscles, in joint angle, sensing the limbs, muscle length, muscle tissue, and these are found in the muscles. Lastly, there are chemoreceptors detecting chemical concentration of the blood. So these detect things such as carbon dioxide, lactic acid in our blood, and all of these send this information to the medulla oblongata, and this impulse then passes the sinoatrial node in the heart via the sympathetic nervous system, and this will transmit more contractions, causing the heart rate to increase. Stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped by one of the ventricles in a contraction. It increases with exercise and then plateaus at a higher level until we stop. So it increases really quickly initially because a lot of blood needs to get pumped to the working muscles. However, it plateaus once this demand is being met by the supply. So an average adult has a stroke volume around 70 milliliters, but Mo Farah actually has one around 110 because he's very highly trained and healthy, and his heart will be extremely strong. His left ventricle will be extremely muscular, allowing lots of a really strong contraction, pumping lots of blood to his working muscles. Explaining why also Mo Farah has such a low heart rate, around 33 beats per minute, because he can pump so much out per beat that his heart rate doesn't actually need to rise that much. There are a number of factors that impact this. So stroke volume is based on the venous return of someone. So veins have pocket valves. These prevent backflow of blood. And if these, in healthy people, these work well, then it's going to mean a high stroke volume. Muscles help increase blood flow because they squeeze the veins around the body. And a muscle pump also increases venous return because when the working muscles contract, it helps squeeze all the blood back up to the heart. Next, when we exercise, our breathing becomes deeper and faster, squeezing large veins and blood back up to the heart, and gravity also allows blood from above the heart to return to the heart due to gravity. So Starling's law implies that stroke volume increases as the heart fills with blood, showing that it's dependent on venous return. So stroke volume can increase also just due to greater contractions of the heart when we exercise. A decrease in venous return leads to a decrease in stroke volume, and in turn decreasing cardiac output. Of course, an increase in venous return will increase stroke volume, increasing cardiac output. So Mo Farah will actually have a very high venous return due to the amount that he trains and the intensity of his training, making him very healthy and strong. His pocket valves will be healthy, preventing any backflow, and his muscles will be very strong, helping squeeze all the blood back up to the heart. So Mo Farah's heart fills up with a lot of blood, which can then be pushed out of the heart in a contraction. Next, there's cardiac output. This is the volume of blood pumped out of the heart in a minute. This can be calculated by multiplying stroke volume with heart rate. So when we begin exercising, our cardiac output will increase significantly due to both the heart rate and stroke volume increasing to pump more blood to the working muscles. This will plateau when the cardiac output is then meeting the demand for oxygen at the working muscles. The average adult has a cardiac output around 4,900 milliliters per minute at rest, whereas Mo Farah's is quite a bit lower than this at 3,630. And this is just because Mo Farah has a much lower demand for oxygen because he is extremely fit and healthy and has a very high cardiovascular endurance. Blood pressure is the force that is exerted by blood upon the walls of the blood vessels, especially arteries, and it's measured by systolic pressure over diastolic pressure. So as you start to exercise, our systolic pressure is the pressure of the blood when the heart contracts. This increases in line with exercise and then begins to plateau during steady state. This is because the heart needs to pump blood faster to the working muscles to provide oxygen. But once this meets the demands of oxygen sufficiently, it will stay around this sort of value. Whereas diastolic is the pressure of the blood when the heart relaxes. So this stays the same or may even decrease with exercise due to the fact that the atria can't actually fill up fast enough before the heart needs to pump blood to the working muscles. Next, there's blood flow. So the vascular shunt refers to distribution of blood around the body. When we exercise, the vascular system redistributes blood to the areas with greatest demand for oxygen away from areas with a lower demand. So there's vasodilation and vasoconstriction. Vasodilation is actually when the blood vessels widen. This occurs during cardiac systole. The main function of this is to increase blood flow in the body to tissues that need it most. So when Mo Farah is taking part in his steady state exercise, every time his heart contracts, his arteries widen, increasing blood flow to his working muscles. Vasoconstriction is the narrowing of blood vessels, which occurs during diastole, and it decreases blood flow, increasing blood pressure. Next, we're onto the respiratory system. So firstly, there's breathing rate. So when we start exercising, our breathing rate increases very rapidly because there's a sudden increase in demand for oxygen in the muscles, and also an increase in carbon dioxide production. This continues to rise when we exercise, but then it begins to level off once the oxygen supply is being met and the carbon dioxide is being removed. So when Mo Farah does a 5,000 meter training run, for example, the first minute or two, his breathing rate will rise a little bit, slightly, to meet respiratory demands, and then after this, his breathing rate will level off, plateau, and stay around that level because his working muscles are getting the required oxygen and the carbon dioxide is being removed. Tidal volume is the air displaced between normal inhalation and exhalation when no additional effort is being put in. So when we start exercising, tidal volume will increase a lot to begin with because we'll suddenly start breathing more deeply to meet the demand for oxygen. This will level off once the oxygen demand is being met. So in a healthy young human adult, tidal volume is approximately 500 millilitres per inspiration, but trained athletes like Mo Farah are much likely to have a higher value for tidal volume due to their muscles and lungs working far more efficiently. So when Farah trains, his tidal volume will increase initially and then level off at a higher value. This explains why Mo Farah's breathing rate doesn't really increase that significantly because he can push a lot of air out of his lungs with each breath, so his breathing rate doesn't actually need to rise that much. So this is an oxygen dissociation curve here, and this represents the percentage saturation of oxygen at hemoglobin at various different partial pressures of oxygen. The more loaded with oxygen the hemoglobin is, the higher the percentage saturation. When oxygen unloads from hemoglobin, this is actually known as dissociation. So when Mo Farah exercises, his curve will move to the right of the curve of when he's resting. So when he starts exercising, there'll be an increase in carbon dioxide production. This will diffuse into his red blood cells and combine with water to form carbonic acid. This will then form hydrogen carbonate and a hydrogen proton, which will then dissociate into oxyhemoglobin. And then this oxygen can dissociate from the hemoglobin, diffuse out of the red blood cell and travel to Mo Farah's working muscles. This is known as the Bohr effect. So the more carbon dioxide that's produced, the more oxygen is going to dissociate from the hemoglobin, and the dissociation curve will move further to the right. So energy continuum. So this helps us show us how various energy systems interact to provide energy for ATP resynthesis. Specific systems don't tend to work on their own, they tend to work at different percentages. And so, for example, the ATP-PC system, the bond between the phosphate and creatine is broken to produce a phosphate for ATP resynthesis. Lactic acid produces 2 phosphates for ATP resynthesis. And all of these, and the aerobic system as well, produces 38 phosphates for ATP resynthesis. So all of the systems contribute to ATP resynthesis during steady state. So this is an overview of the aerobic system. This produces energy required for the resynthesis of ATP from ADP. which works for about 3 minutes or more, but it can work for up to a long time, like even an hour or multiple hours. It works aerobically with oxygen, but somewhere between 60 to 80% of maximum heart rate. In the mitochondria of working muscles, and it uses our glycogen stores, which are present through food intake. It produces 38 phosphates, and the byproducts are carbon dioxide and water. So there's 3 different stages of this. The first one is called aerobic glycolysis. So the enzyme GP stimulates the breaking down of glycogen into glucose, which is then converted into pyruvic acid, stimulated by an enzyme called phosphofructokinase. It has the same steps as the lactic acid system, but then up until glucose is converted into pyruvic acid. If they are available, then it's converted into lactic acid. However, if oxygen is available, then the pyruvic acid will combine with an enzyme called coenzyme A to form acetyl coenzyme A. And this happens in the mitochondria, producing 2 phosphates. Next, there's the Krebs cycle, which starts with acetyl coenzyme A and is combined with oxaloacetic acid to produce the citric acid. This has 4 products, which are carbon dioxide, 2 phosphates, hydrogen, and oxaloacetic acid. Lastly, there's the electron transport chain. The hydrogen from the Krebs cycle is added to the electrons NAD and FAD to become NADH and FADH. The electrons go through the chain and become hydrogen electrons and hydrogen ions. The ions form water molecules, allowing us to sweat and cool down, so we can regulate our temperature whilst we exercise. The electrons produce 34 phosphates, which we can continue to use to resynthesize ATP. This is very well suited to activities like 5,000 meters because it lasts a long time, as long as possible, depending on what food like fuel we have in our bodies, and the byproducts are carbon dioxide and water. So when Mo Farah first starts his long distance running, it's likely that he'll mostly use his ATP stores, because when you start exercising, your body has to work extremely hard to meet the sudden rise in oxygen demand. So after a couple of minutes, it will transition into him predominantly using his aerobic system, because he'll be working somewhere between 60 to 80% of his heart rate with oxygen. This will provide Mo Farah with a lot of energy which will last a long time. He could use this for hours, providing that a lot of his food intake contained glycerol, which could then be converted into glucose. Mo Farah takes part in quite low intensity, long duration activities, so the aerobic system is very well suited to this, because he won't fatigue using this system, because both the byproducts, carbon dioxide and water, can easily be removed. Onto the neuromuscular system. So muscle spindles are proprioceptors, which can be found in skeletal muscles. They detect a stretch, and subsequently there's a reflex resisting this. It sends the information to the central nervous system, and next the central nervous system will transmit information to the motor neuron, causing that specific muscle to contract, reducing the stretch. So when Mo Farah trains and this happens, it will give him a smoother movement and also reduces his chance of injury, because he's preventing it from overstretching, pulling a muscle, for example. The Golgi tendon organ is a normal component of the reflex arc of the peripheral nervous system. It operates as a protective feedback mechanism to control the tension of an active muscle by causing relaxation before the tendon tension becomes high enough to cause damage. First, as a load is placed on it, the Golgi tendon fires into the central nervous system. The motor neuron is inhibited and the muscle relaxes. So these two actually work together, the muscle spindle and the Golgi tendon, reflexively, which regulates muscle stiffness. So the muscle spindle produces muscular contraction, whereas the Golgi tendon organs sense any muscular tension within muscles that are stretching or contracting. If the Golgi tendon is activated during a contraction, then it inhibits the contraction caused by the muscle spindle. This is automatic. If the Golgi tendon is activated during a stretch, it will inhibit the muscle spindle from creating a contraction, allowing a deeper stretch to occur at that certain muscle. Golgi tendon organs are responsible for sensing changes in tension, and as soon as they are aware of an overload of this, information is then sent to the brain. Right, cool. Thank you, that's my assignment 2.2.